Welcome, one and all, to the Gothic Horror Movies panel. I am extremely excited to host this. We came up with this idea to promote Bruce Wright's Nightwalkers, Gothic Horror Movies, the revised edition, which debuts today, August 4th. My name is Jason Henderson. I am the host of the Castle of Horror podcast, and I'm a co-publisher at Castle Bridge Media. With me are Bruce Wright, the author of Nightwalkers, Grady Hendrix, New York Times bestselling author of Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, Mark Jordan Legan of NPR and the Film Freaks Forever podcast, which is fabulous, and Danielle Trussoni, who is a New York Times bestselling author of The Ancestor. Let's start with Grady. Grady, tell us a little about yourself.
Oh, yeah. Well, no, I write horror. My last book was the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, which is about a book club in the South killing vampires. And, you know, I'm not exactly sure what Gothic means. I mean, it seems to encompass everything from, depending on someone's mood, Flannery O'Connor to the Castle of Otranto. So I feel like it's a bit of a catch-all. But if you're looking for favorite Gothic movies, for me, I mean, book and movie, I wind up with Rebecca, which I just think is an astonishing book. I mean, it's just an amazing thing. And the movie's not bad. You know, that Alfred Hitchcock, he's got a lot of promise.
Yeah, there's a new Rebecca coming, apparently, and
there is. Wait, who's doing that?
I don't know. I don't know anything about it. But Mr. Sony posted about it earlier today.
Mr. Sony.
So if she hasn't disappeared, perhaps she can tell us. Mark Jordan Legan, tell us a little bit about yourself and your podcast.
Yes. Well, I'm really happy to be here. I've known Jason at least through telephone calls and podcasts for a long time. I'm a TV writer and I'm a film historian for NPR. I'm a regular contributor to NPR and Slate. And yes, I co-host the podcast Film Freaks Forever that you can find everywhere, thank goodness. I really enjoyed the book, and I do love the genre of Gothic horror. I agree that there's so many, a wide range of descriptions. It's hard for me to narrow it down, though. I'm a huge fan of some of the quote-unquote modern Gothic horrors. I'm a huge fan of The Haunting. Robert Wise's film, The Haunting, is probably one of my all-time favorites. And as a book, I loved Henry James' Turn of the Screw, and so I'm a fan of The Innocence as well, the film from 1961.
Oh, yeah.
Directed by the very strange Jack Clayton. He had the weirdest career. Guy directed everything from Room at the Top to The Innocence, and then, in my opinion, a not very good version of The Great Gatsby in the 70s. But
Oh, that was his. Okay.
Yeah. But The Innocence and The Haunting, at least movie-wise. But I have so many. I do love the genre.
That's really cool. Mr. Sony, if you're on, tell us a little about yourself. And you were saying that you come to all of this from a book perspective.
Yeah. So am I muted? Can you hear me? Because it was kind of, okay, good. So yeah, I do come to this all from more of a book perspective than a film perspective. I am, a novelist. I wrote, a couple of novels that are considered Gothic. The latest being The Ancestor. And then I also write the horror column for the New York Times Book Review, where Gothic, sort of neo-Gothic and Gothic fiction is probably my favorite subgenre that I love to review and highlight. As for movies, I've just always loved, basically Polanski's sort of Gothic films like The Tenant and Rosemary's Baby and although, Grady sort of stole my favorite Gothic novel, which is Rebecca. Mm-hmm. And I also love, by Daphne du Maurier, I love her short story, The Birds, which was, of course, made into another Hitchcock film. And, her whole sensibility of sort of literary Gothic and, that whole vein of Gothic writing that goes back to, the Brontes and Wuthering Heights and Frankenstein and so many other sort of the female sensibility in the Gothic is something that I really, really love. But yeah, I'm excited actually to listen to you guys talk about Gothic film, because I have a lot to learn, and I'm very interested in Gothic film. So thank you for having me on the panel.
Well, you call that a great example. I mean, I love Jamaica Inn, by the way, the novel. Yeah. I haven't seen that miniseries from a couple of years ago. I have no idea if it's any good, but I love the book. It's another great Gothic from DeMar.
Yeah, she's just amazing, right? She's just amazing. I've been reading. I have sort of queued up to read the books that she wrote about her family who were glass blowers in Venice. And she just had such range and such a great sensibility, and I love the way that she uses darkness to sort of illuminate so many sides of culture and society that that's another element of the Gothic I think that's often overlooked, is that there is a social element I think to it, and something that Mr. Wright points out in his book, sort of introduces the concept of awe in horror that is so important, so interesting. But yeah, Daphne du Maurier is a rock star for sure.
Thank you very much. Bruce, so it's very exciting. You and I actually hadn't talked in person in going on 20 years, but I'm so excited that you're here, and it's just very strange to get a chance to be working together. But tell us a little bit about yourself and how it is that you came to be writing a book on Gothic horror film. And actually, our next topic after this is what the heck is Gothic? So you may as well start that as the tail end of your answer.
Well, okay, I'm a writer, editor by trade. I have done it since God was a boy. Millions of words, most of it pretty dull because that's where the money is. And but I've also been a lifelong fan of science fiction, fantasy, and horror. I like it all pretty much equally. When I started, things weren't so balkanized. Now you meet like Star Trek fans that have never read a science fiction book and so forth. But I'm fond of it all. And Nightwalkers is basically an attempt to capture and crystallize what you could call the Silver Age of Gothic horror, which started in 1957 and runs through about the end of Hammer Studios around 1976. And when you're talking about Gothic, I think there's a couple of things that really define Gothic horror as opposed to other forms, which would be, first of all, it's like heightened operatic emotion. And secondly, there has to be some aspect of antiquity. That's all comes right out of Horace Walpole, the man who really created the Gothic movement in fiction more than anything else. He was the first guy, the first fellow who wrote about it in Western literature to become interested in antiquity as a positive in its own right. He built the mansion Strawberry Hill as sort of a fantasy Gothic pile, and his book, A Castle of Otranto, originally he told everyone it was translated from the medieval Italian. But so there always has to be something of that feeling of, and he supplied a lot of the furniture, if you will, castles, dark passages, supernatural revenge. I also tend to feel like horror, and I know some people disagree with it, I feel like horror really has to have some element of the transcendent, of the supernatural, because otherwise, I'm not a fan of what Roger Ebert used to call dead teenager cinema. I'm talking about...
and he wasn't either, for what it's worth. I mean, he was famously unhappy with all of that. But go ahead, yeah.
Well, so anyway, I mean, that's where I define it. The two things that happened in 1957 that really kicked it off were first the release of the Shock Theater package to television screens all across America, because people forget this, TV and movies were barely on speaking terms in the 1950s. In 1957, Universal finally said, okay, fine, and they dumped almost all of their horror catalog to syndication for television. That's where all of the horror hosts come from. And that's really where, Famous Monsters of Filmland springs out of all that. And I remember I was young. I remember there were horror bubblegum cards and all that sort of thing. It became huge in America by the early 60s. The other thing that happened in 57, of course, was Hammer Studios started to put out its first film, Curse of Frankenstein, which kicked this whole genre off, at least in terms of the Silver Age I'm discussing in the book.
Thank you very much. So that's interesting, because that gives us the beginning answer of, what is Gothic, and it's and you said it. Your book is describing a cycle that runs roughly from 1957 to 1976, and what I'm wondering is, why do we use, and if you guys can help me, because I feel like the more I learn about this, the less I understand it. Because I feel like I have a handle on Gothic horror. I'm actually editing, an anthology on Gothic horror in novels. But it seems like if you look at architecture and art and books and all that stuff, the only thing they all have in common is castles. Like how are we supposed to, Grady, Danielle, Mark, help me. Like, why? It seems like if you shout the word Gothic on a bus, people will understand what you mean. But I'm having a trouble understanding what I mean. Oh, Grady, you're muted.
Oh, yeah, I know. Jesus, I'm like an old person.
Well, you were shouting
you have to take
on a bus, and we were warned about you.
Yeah. I think you have to take the architecture out of it, because that whole Gothic revival thing, it was really about a return to craft. There were so many things it was about that had to do with antiquity, but I don't think it jives with the horror angle of Gothic. But Gothic's weird. So I sort of felt like there are four things, trying to get it all under one tent, that I feel like maybe, I don't know. One is that it's about a group, or it's about something domestic. It's a family, it's a group dynamic, it's relationships, whether it's a Gothic romance about a young governess coming and the lord of the manor, is dark and dashing, or it's the Castle of Otranto with a cursed family, or it's the fall of the House of Usher, or it's Harry Crew's Southern Gothic. It's always about families or groups. Interview with the Vampire, it's about this ad hoc family. It's always about that dynamic, that domestic dynamic. I think Bruce just said it's, and I think it's true. It's often about secrets. It's often about secret knowledge, something that's not apparent on the surface, something that only insiders know. And it's about an insider discovering that knowledge. I feel like there's often an air of self-consciousness to it, almost like theatricality. Whether it's something like Castle of Otranto or Turn of the Screw or Rebecca, which is being told, right? Mm-hmm. Rebecca's being told to the reader. Castle of Otranto is letters that have been found. The Turn of the Screw is a story around a campfire. Christopher Lee, you look at him in some of the Hammer movies, he's giving this very real performance of evil. They're very conscious of the viewer. And I know that's a little vague, but I always feel like there's a self-consciousness to the Gothic, this theatrical, being told this. And then the last thing is, I feel like there's a bit of a sexual dominant submission thing to it. It's a like all these Edgar Allan Poe people are submissive to this family curse. Oh, there's no point in fighting it. It's just going to ream us no matter what we do. It's this dominant male figure like Dracula or some dark, figure. There's this real sort of like families sort of forcing their members into line. Uncle Silas with the uncle dominating his niece. There's this real thing of submitting your will to someone. So I sort of figure there's a secret somehow involved, secret knowledge. There's a dom sub thing. It's about a domestic situation, a family, a house, a group, and there's this self-conscious theatricality. I'm sure people are going to come up with a dozen examples that don't hew to any of that.
Well, it's very true what you're saying. And also, as you were, there's a lot about the battle, the internal struggle of morality with these people, or the forces of humanity versus unnatural forces. And I always just like how they're almost always in just a bleak landscape. Lots of times in a bleak landscape. But, and again, you brought up Herman Walpole's, Horace Walpole's, first book and everything. But I also loved how during the Victorian era, how popular Gothic novels were. And in fact, I think Bram Stoker, right, 1897, so that falls into that. But I loved the actual novel of The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And you want to talk about like internal struggle. I mean, literally with one man is that, and boy, there was nothing like, I was very lucky. I didn't see the movie. I read that book very young. And so it's such a wonderful way to read it as opposed to knowing the plot, seeing the movie, and then going back and reading that.
Although that Mamoulian movie is amazing.
Yes.
Is that the one with Frederick March, Grady?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Marion Francis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But he's so sadistic.
It's an amazing movie.
Mr. Hyde is horrible.
And of course, back then in the 30s, how they used almost just the lighting to do the transformation on his face. In fact, I might be in the minority here. I think it's one time Spencer Tracy was actually bad. I don't like the Spencer Tracy, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
I'm with you.
Yeah.
March all the way.
Yeah.
Because there's something sexless about Spencer Tracy, and Jekyll and Hyde is like a weird, sexually fraught story.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. And also in the Victorian era, it always kind of gets somewhat swept under the rug. I love The Woman in White.
Wilkie Collins, yeah.
Yes, love it. And actually, they, maybe in the 80s they made a movie version, which wasn't bad, but the book is just great. And then of course, a picture of Dorian Gray falls in the Victorian era, which I just love too. I love that.
But if I can throw this in there, you mentioned that whole Victorian period, but I actually really love the derivative stuff. In other words, the whole 1960s and 70s period of where Rebecca, which is 1948, Rebecca becomes Mistress of Mellon, which was by Victoria Holt, and Mistress of Mellon becomes, and that's like a crystallized version of Rebecca, and then they basically just keep rewriting Rebecca then for 20 years.
Doing all the Edgar Allan Poe stuff.
So fabulous, but it's so cool because you pick one of those up and it's like straight to the vein, pure Gothic, like drama. All that heightened emotion kind of stuff, and that was dominant at the same time that these movies that ostensibly are on topic, but that was like dominant. And then about the same time that Bruce says it all fell apart, the Gothic movement in books fell apart as well. Yeah. And can I turn a question back to Bruce for a second? Why 1976? Like if it's all castles and Vincent Price wearing red and beautiful colors and people declaiming and all this stuff, vampires, what happens in 76 that causes it all to fall apart?
Well, when you're defining an era, you have to pick a beginning and an end. It seemed to me the end of Hammer Studios was a logical place. Although I feel like if you look at the cinema of those days, it was just about over with at that point. I think the whole thing had just become to seem out of fashion, old-fashioned, and at least temporarily, it dropped off our screens, although Anne Rice would be along fairly shortly, but at that point. Right. So, when talking about the films, I think it bookends it nicely because Hammer certainly did the most consistent, the most prolific attempt to put Gothic horror on the screen. It wasn't all good, but it had a stamp to it. You can always tell a Hammer film, at least in the great days.
Yeah.
Partly because Hammer was really a family, and the way that most movies are not. Most movie production companies are not.
Can you describe what that look is like? If there's a palette or a deck of cards that says this is what makes a Hammer movie, what is that?
Again, you're going to have heightened emotion, and this is underlined by. It's frequently underlined by James Bernard's pounding scores. They always bring that across too. And then you have to attribute a lot of it to Bernard Robinson, the production designer, who appears in film after film. And he was one of the great geniuses at making not much look like something on the screen.
Yeah. Oh,
if you look really closely, you realize that all those marble floors are painted paper. And he could build he could build ancient Egypt out of paper mache, and it all looked great. So Bernard Robinson, you can't say enough about him. Dick Clemenson from Little Shop of Horrors has always said he might be the real heart and soul of Hammer. More even than the Terence Fisher, the director, or some of the other people. But again, you had a relatively small number of people that worked again and again on movie after movie, and they had their acts together. And yes, it all kind of crumbles towards the end, and there were a lot of economic reasons behind that as well. But they put a stamp on it. You can, Hammer movies don't look like much of anybody else's movies, except when Amicus started trying to imitate them. But
right. Okay, so I do want to ask, but you mentioned Amicus, and you mentioned Hammer falling apart at the end, and it's fun reading in the book actually the really sort of more wacko Hammers towards the end. But I want to ask the panelists if you have a personal favorite Gothic horror. It doesn't have to be Hammer, because there's stuff going on in the United States as well. There's Corman kind of suddenly becoming a genius and all this stuff. So, starting with Grady, what would be your favorite? Answer this however you want. Like if you're saying to somebody, you got to see this Gothic horror film, preferably mid-century, what would be your choice?
Well, I'll give a mid-century and a modern day. Mid-century, I would say The Innocence, the Deborah Kerr movie. I just think it's, and it's funny. It's interesting what Bruce was just saying about Hammer, because when someone says Hammer, I think of a certain set of things, but Hammer did, Never Take Candy from a Stranger and Cash on Demand. Like, they did these weird black and white movies that were very gritty and very strange. Hammer was a weird place. I almost feel like they were split personality. And one of my favorite sort of Hammer classic high vampire movies, Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, because it was such a misbegotten production. I mean, it was their one that was like, it was going to be, they needed some fresh angles. It was 70s, and so they decided to make a Hong Kong Kung Fu movie that was also a Hammer vampire movie.
Yeah.
And it was, who was the director on the Hammer side, Bruce? Do you remember? It was someone, it was like Terrence, it wasn't Terence Fisher, but it was like.
He was out by then.
Yeah.
Whoever it was, I've read him talking about it, and that was one hell of a shoot.
And he has nothing but contempt for that shoot. Yeah.
Half of them didn't understand what the other half were saying. So
yeah. And on the Hong Kong side, it was Lily Lee and was the female lead, David Chang, who was huge, and then Chang Che was the director, and then I think it was Lau Kar Lung, who's like an amazing action director doing the action. And it is a weird movie. And they even did Dynamite, I think, distribute it in the US and did this cut. Like it did well in the UK, and Warner's had it for the US, and they just were like, this is garbage. And they held on to it for years before sub-licensing it to Howard, I can't remember his last name, but who was this head of Dynamite, which was a low-level distributor who just hacked it to pieces. He took like 20 minutes out of it. The first 5 minutes runs in slow motion to pad out the running time.
Oh, to make the Seven Brothers versus Dracula, right?
Yeah, and exactly. But it's got this weird sort of stoner psychotronic quality to it.
It was Roy Ward Baker, by the way. It was the director. Yeah,
it was like a serial killer.
I'm looking it up in the book.
5 million years to Earth. He did some good things.
Yeah, he did great stuff.
Yeah.
But in terms of modern day Gothic, I really, really think Guy Maddin has a lot going, the Canadian director. And he did a movie called Dracula Pages from a Virgin's Diary. That's a ballet of Dracula. And he does things with a very silent movie aesthetic. He builds all his own sets. He does these meticulous costumes. And they're crazy, these movies. And Dracula is this overheated old school. It's the kind of movie that you feel like, well, maybe not Christopher Lee, because he was apparently a very boring person in real life, but maybe Peter Cushing would dream about if he was like, had a few too many drinks in the middle of a production. Like, it's just this fever dream theme of ballet dancers and sexuality and Dracula, and it's all on this giant set. It's really amazing.
I remember that one. Wow. Okay, so that was actually a good model, because your answer was it was the Innocence, and for a wacko one, Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, and then you did a modern one, which was the ballet. All right. So what I don't even remember what order we went in earlier. So I'll just go to we'll ask Mr. Legan. Mark, what do you recommend somebody watch as a Gothic horror film?
Well, I think in my earlier, little piece, I did mention being a big fan of The Haunting, the Robert Wise film from 1963, and I had mentioned The Innocence, and I'm huge fans of those. I would highly recommend those. I also really like, and again, we've talked about the wide boundaries of what is Gothic. Can we count Night of the Demon?
Oh, that's an excellent
film. And
yes.
I love that film, and I was so fortunate. In my early 30s, I became dear friends with Charles Bennett, the screenwriter.
Wow.
For those of you who know, he lived very long. He lived to be 95, and he was sharp as a stick till the end. And I was working with a producer, and I was having a play done in LA, and they brought Charles Bennett, in his wheelchair to the play, and he loved it. And, he was so old school, he invited me to his house for cocktails. And we're talking 4 p.m. drinking scotch, and I'm not a drinker.
Right.
And oh my God, it was one of the greatest things in my life, was getting to know Charles for like the last 5 years of his life. And the stories, I would just let him go, and he would just tell me these wonderful stories. But like, we're sitting at his, and by the way, the house he was in, I think it was Benedict Canyon or Stone Canyon, but he goes, I bought this house from James Cagney, and I gave him in a brown paper bag. And then I'd be sitting at the wet bar. He goes, right where you're sitting, Rex Harrison vomited all over himself. So we could do a whole 3-hour thing about just Charles Bennett, but I love that film, Night of the Demon. So I would recommend that to somebody. And then the more, modern stuff, I actually was surprised. Someone recommended it to me. 2012, I liked Woman in Black. I don't know if you guys saw.
Oh, yeah. It was ostensibly a new Hammer movie, right? In theory?
Yeah. And yes, exactly. And then I did like Alejandro, I'm probably mispronouncing his last name, Amenabar, but he made The Others. In 2001, and I really liked that. I really did. So those are some more, at least in this last, decade-ish or so, that I would recommend. But there's a lot out there, and a lot of them are in Bruce's book, which you can use as your guide.
Yeah. I used to invite people over, and we would watch horror movies. This was when I worked for Electronic Arts, and I would just get up in front of the TV and wave the book around and just like, tonight we're watching, Brides of Dracula, and I'd flip to it. So I believe that we've lost Danielle, and hopefully she's okay. Danielle had lost power, and I think was actually losing juice on her phone as well. So I'm sure we'll hear from her again. It's very kind of her to take the time out during a hurricane to dial in. Bruce, so what about you? If you were to recommend like something that people would watch, I know from reading your book that you also find The Innocence to be maybe one of the finest films.
I really think I think The Innocence is probably the best film of its kind in that era. But that said, I agree with everything everybody else has mentioned, but a couple we haven't brought up yet. I'm also very fond of Black Sunday by Mario Bava, and in Italian, Mask of the Demon, I think it's called. And so you can't forget that for that sinuous camera work and just...
and Black Sabbath by Bava.
Yeah, they're both gorgeous films. And then just to pick something out of the corner here, I'm always been a defender of Herc Harvey's masterpiece Carnival of Souls, which, despite being filmed for about $52, I really find, I find it both effective and haunting in a literal way. There's imagery in that sticks with you. The Dance of the Dead and the ruined carnival setting, or it's not a carnival, you know what it is, some sort of fun center they found out in the desert. And so
it was the Saltaire Pavilion.
That's it, the Saltaire Pavilion.
Yeah, in Salt Lake City, right.
I really, and he was out of Syntron, and his main job was making those commercial, industrial films that are parodied on Mystery Science Theater. But I really liked Carnival of Souls. And so I would think if anybody is broad-minded enough to accept a certain weakness in production values and a couple of performances, there's a lot there to like. As far as modern things go, I'd probably say, maybe The Devil's Backbone, or to me it seems like Guillermo del Toro is probably the only filmmaker working right now who can get projects together who really gets it. And Pan's Labyrinth. That's another fabulous film. So,
what I find fascinating is, and I'm writing down a note here that I want to follow up on something to ask all of you. But I find fascinating that all of you mentioned, other than anything filmed past like 1997 or Legend of the Seven Golden Vampires, all of you listed black and white films, which is funny because when I think of Gothic horror, the first thing that pops to mind is Vincent Price in his long red coat, color. And and I'm wondering, is that because it's hard, if we're just talking to a friend who doesn't know anything about this stuff, you want to invite them to a good movie, you send them to the Innocence, but I'm as likely to send them to Lust for a Vampire or Brides of Dracula is a good film, but still, like something that captures that palette that I think is so unique to the 60s, and you'll never see again. I mean, it would be impossible. I don't know. I didn't even know how you would create it, other than to use a computer to imitate Technicolor film stock or something.
Well, first of all, a lot of the Hammer stuff was shot in Eastman, and that was
okay. I apologize. Right.
That was specifically because, at least early on, you think of Technicolor, you think of all those detergent bright popping colors, and Technicolor was really hard to use with shadows. It was really hard to use with, dim sets and stuff. So one of the things that Hammer did was that they found that Eastman was, lent itself to that kind of shadowy film better. Probably it was cheaper too. I mean, that fits in with those guys.
Yeah. As
far as the black and white, we were only dealing with the top 3 or 4. If we get down to 10, we'll start listing.
Right.
Well, it's interesting. Bruce mentioned Bava. And Bava's really interesting because I feel like, except for Black Sunday, none of his movies, subject-wise, are Gothics. They're not about families. They're not really about secrets so much. I don't think of their subject. There are no vampires except for on a planet. But they look Gothic. There's the mist, the fog, the sense of these claustrophobic sets, this denseness to the production design, this decoration on deck. I mean, look at Hercules in the Haunted World, which couldn't be further in terms of subject matter from a Gothic, but it's this density, this Baroque quality, the production design, it looks Gothic. And so Bava's really interesting. I mean, most of his movies, except for a few of the early ones, are color, and he looks Gothic, but I don't think his subject matter is Gothic.
Maybe Barren Blood. I mean, that's not anybody's idea of a
good
maybe,
movie. With the castle,
Black Sabbath, which is an anthology, Black Sabbath. But God, the one drop of water is horrifying. I saw that when I was 9 years old, and the old woman rises up the bed, and the set looks Gothic, and the colors, the red and the green.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, yes. Yeah.
I think that of his films, I think that one kind of falls through the cracks, and that one's amazing.
And the Boris Karloff one, and that the Vordelak is a great short film.
Yeah. And
one of the distinctions that Bruce made was, Bruce, you didn't really get into, if I recall, I don't think you spend much time with the Amicus anthologies because they're modern. They're not specifically speaking Gothic, and they're fascinating nevertheless. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm saying I had to pick and choose, and I mean I like some of those. I mean I like Dr. Terror and so forth, but actually my favorite of the Subotsky stuff though is probably Horror Hotel, even though it's silly, but wow,
oh golly,
looking
that's a Horror Hotel is amazing.
It is.
Yeah.
Amicus was always like the ugly stepchild, and they didn't really do Gothic, but their anthologies. I mean, 1972's Tales of the Crypt. Oh my God.
Oh yeah.
Amazing. And
Joan Collins.
Asylum. I like Asylum and Torture Garden.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Torture Garden was all I'm sorry, Bloch. It was all Robert Bloch. Because they did the one about the man who collected Poe. They actually turned that into a movie. Or at least a short story. Grady, I'm sorry,
I was just going to say,
Horror Hotel.
Horror Hotel is amazing to me because it's American, or it's set in America, which is very rare. I find with Gothic, like Gothic literature, you get a fair amount of Nathaniel Hawthorne, things like that, but Henry James. But you don't get a lot of Gothic feeling movies that are set in America. And Horror Hotel, I think, is one of the few from that era.
I have a theory about that one, which is that the reason it works is because it's set in America and made by people who don't live in America. And so, first of all, you get the weirdo accents that are all over in that movie. It's so great. I could watch that movie tonight. But second, America there, the New England of that movie is an imaginary New England the same way that we have an imaginary Cornwall and an imaginary London, because we're all just guys living in the United States. And it's so cool how suddenly they say New England as though it were magical, and that's really neat.
England.
Yeah, the New England. Yeah.
For those of us who are Lovecraft fans, New England carries a special meaning, and so it works for me. So
it's a very good point.
Well, just to jump in when y'all were talking about Amicus, it's funny. Sometimes the knockoffs are better, and sometimes the knockoffs are worse. And I'm thinking of Fellini's Toby Dammit, which is a knockoff Mario Bava movie, which I don't think that great.
I have not seen this.
It's great.
Wow.
I mean, I like it a lot for what it is, but for a Fellini movie, Bava would have done it better. I mean, it's literally a Bava movie.
That's a segment in Spirits of the Dead, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's what I thought.
And Vadim does one of the segments, and I can't remember who does the third. He does Warren Wilson, the doppelganger story.
William Wilson. No,
What's the third segment in that?
This is 1969. I haven't seen it. I want to turn us over to questions. By the way, the segments are Metzingerstein, William Wilson, and Toby Dammit. So we all got to watch this. I know we got some questions in the audience. So the first one was from David. And it was, did Star Wars and the blockbusters in the mid to late 70s play any role in the decline of Gothic horror?
Call me. No,
yeah, please, take it away.
No, but The Exorcist did. The Exorcist, I think, really changed the game in horror film. And for better or worse, shoved it into a direction that made a lot of other things look kind of out of date, really. You look at the state, you think about it, The Exorcist came out at almost the exact same time as Legend of Hell House. And Legend of Hell House basically got peed on by the critics because it wasn't The Exorcist. It had...
it's so good. Legend of Hell House is such a beautiful piece.
The Exorcist is a good movie too, but it's
no doubt. Yeah.
But again, in 75, Jaws did change everything for better. I mean, because let's be honest, Jaws was like a B-movie drive-in thing that you would have seen. There was a shark killing a bunch of people. But it was done with a big studio, and then when it made all that money, it changed everything. And then every studio had no patience to slowly build a movie. They wanted that weekend. And by the way, quick plug, but our latest podcast for Film Freaks Forever is about the early part of Steven Spielberg's career, all of his television work, but leading up to Jaws. And only because we just researched this, Jaws made $471 million in 1975. That's equal to $2 billion.
Wow.
So after that, studios were like, where's my Jaws?
Where's my Jaws?
Where's my instant summer blockbuster? And so I think the little films that could kind of play places and find an audience, no, gone. So...
Mark, by the way, your podcast has given me so many movies where I hear something about on your podcast, and I that weekend go watch it, and it's been a good experience.
Oh, I'm glad to hear
Big Wednesday, which I had never seen before, but was just a stunningly good film.
That's Milius, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and
I love his stuff.
Well, here's the interesting thing in the podcast. We mentioned this. Milius and George Lucas and Spielberg were all friends, really good friends.
Yeah.
And they helped him get the deal to make Big Wednesday. But when they saw Big Wednesday, they thought that's going to be the big hit.
Yeah.
And so Milius gave them some points, but George Lucas gave Milius points for Star Wars.
Oh,
which,
wow.
as you know, the studio hated. No one had faith in Star Wars. So, boy, did Milius, he made like hundreds of thousands of dollars just from George Lucas helping him out that way. But
he presents the 3 stars of Big Wednesday are gods. They even come through a sort of a portal. Yeah, this archway. They're gods, and it's amazing work. And Dying Room Only. I know we got to get to more questions, but Dying Room Only. Julia and I watched that like 2 weeks ago, and we were just on the edge of our seats.
The great
from
Richard
beginning to
Matheson,
end.
Cloris Leachman, Dabney Coleman without a mustache.
Yeah, Matheson. I mean, it's amazing.
Like, wait, Gothic, very quick. Richard Matheson doesn't get enough credit. He wrote the script for House of Usher, the 1960.
Yeah,
and it's a damn good script.
Matheson and Charles Beaumont were writing those things, and they're both amongst the best, fantasy writers of the mid-50s. And so
I worship Matheson.
Which is so weird because they were so identified with Twilight Zone, which is like, to me, the opposite of Gothic.
Yeah.
It's so razor edge versus Gothic sort of misty ephemerality.
Yes.
That's interesting. But there's this sentimentality to the Twilight Zone often that fits.
Yeah, that's true.
Let's see. There was another question in here. While I'm looking for it, and Julia, you can see if there are any questions that I've missed. I had a question. So Bruce brought up riff tracks, MST3K, same thing. And I've talked to purists who say, I will not watch that stuff. I want to watch my art, qua art. And others say, I don't mind it being framed by these commentators and stuff like that. Do you guys think that there's a place in film for comedians like that, or is it hurting our craft?
Most of what they're making fun of, richly deserves to be hurt in some respects. I mean, no, your art is still there. Nobody heard it. It's still there. You don't have to watch this if you don't want to.
That's a good answer. Yeah, I actually really enjoy it personally, but
for the most part,
it's hard. No. It's just if you have more point, I'm just going to go to something else that was in the chat. But please finish your
Please,
thought.
Yeah, no, go for it.
Bruce, are you done?
No.
Okay. I was just going to say, as for the recording purposes, is that Insure had added earlier that Rebecca is an upcoming British romantic thriller film. I'm assuming this is a wiki description, directed by Ben Wheatley from a screenplay by Jane Goldman, Joe Shrapnel, and Anna Waterhouse, based on the 1938 novel. Film stars Lily James, Armie Hammer, Kristen Scott Thomas, Tom Goodman Hill, Keely Hawes, and Sam Riley and Ann Dowd. So that's for the.
So Kristen Scott Thomas must be Mrs. Danforth.
She's the Judith Anderson part. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's only one Judith Anderson.
I mean, I like Ben Wheatley, and I think his wife, who's the screenwriter on that's good. So maybe.
Yeah, maybe. And I like Kristen Scott Thomas. It's just I will always think of Judith Anderson, though.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's a question here from David, but first it's for Bruce. But first I wanted to say to Bruce, like Jason, I haven't seen you in like probably 2 decades when your child was small and mine wasn't born yet, I don't think. And one thing that I remember about hanging out with you and your wife is that you guys talked about Glastonbury so glowingly that we ended up going not once but twice, and it's also our favorite place to go for vacation, Glastonbury.
I go a lot.
So, yeah. Anyway, so the question from David for you is, how has your opinion changed regarding any of the movies you showcase in Nightwalkers?
Well, okay. I mean, do they mean, if you're talking about changed over time, I still have a lot of respect for all these films. Probably the one that I had the biggest change before I wrote it was Carnival of Souls, because the first time I saw it, I was going, what is this cheap looking stuff? Mm-hmm. And then as I got farther into it and I saw it a few times, I think it really started growing on me as a film. But I can't say that most of my opinions on these things have changed all that much. I've just added other things that I've come to like as well. So we were talking about recent films. Now, I talk about cosmic horror some in the book because I feel like H.P. Lovecraft both is and is not a Gothic character.
Yeah.
I mean, his work he springs out of the Gothic, but like all geniuses, he transcends genre. And but you're talking about a recent film that impressed me to no end. It would be The Endless by Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead, which I think may be the greatest Lovecraftian film ever made, even though it makes no reference to HPL at all. I wouldn't call it Gothic, but I would call it mind-bending. I like that a lot. But no, I still like all this stuff. So.
Here's a question, and it was, let me see if I'm going to read it and then see if I understand it. A general question, please address the influence of Hammer on the Corman Poe films and how they fit in the Gothic, because we haven't really mentioned much the Corman stuff. Is there, did they influence one another, or did they just spring up on two sides of the Western Hemisphere, just completely of their own?
Well,
Bruce, take it away. That seems like a question for you. Seems like a softball for you, probably.
Right. I think there's no question that the Poe films, it stretches credulity beyond its limits to think that AIP had not seen the success of the early Hammer films when they were deciding what their next thing to do. I mean, Hammer and AIP were both exploitation companies. They're always looking for the next big thing. And I think it's beyond question that Corman and Arkoff and Nicholson were aware of how well the Hammer films done, particularly the first few. And I think that was probably a big influence on them.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I know that we're running up on time. I just wanted to throw out one more thing about Hammer, which was, and it's to a certain extent true of the AI Poe, but with Hammer, you have this recognizable, not necessarily a shared universe. I mean, the same actors play different characters with a few exceptions, but the world looks the same. You can turn it on and you know that it's a Hammer film with the Cockney accents and the Burgomaster and the weird, kind of Germany, kind of France. It's, and the buxom ladies and all this stuff. And it's just so strange to have this sort of consistent universe long before that was a thing. I mean, although Universal did a very similar deal.
Hey, Jason, before we get off, I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about how you discovered Bruce's book originally, and Bruce, for that matter.
Oh, yeah. So very quickly, in like 1990, a long time ago, I had just gotten out of law school, and I was unemployed, and I was in Austin, Texas. And I remember walking around in the daytime. I think I had like gone to a job interview or something. This is a sad time. Anyway, I wander into the library and I found a copy of Nightwalkers, and it just changed the trajectory of my career. I mean, it's I started writing a Hammer column for some of the early websites at the time. I ended up doing a Dracula comic book. I sent Bruce a letter and said, "Hey, I live in Austin too. Let's grab some coffee." We became friends. So it's it and it really just changed all my career. So it's just so funny that, and I'm so thrilled that Intru, who's on here, he and I founded the Castlebridge Media Press. And one of the first things we did is like, we need to reissue this book. So I'm so thrilled. But I just wanted to say, Mark and Grady and Danny, though you're not on, I know this is being recorded. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk about Gothic horror. I know, to be honest with you, I feel like we could probably talk for 3 or 4 more hours and just kind of talk about favorite stuff.
Yeah.
But this was really delightful, and thank you very, very much for being on.
Oh,
pleasure.
Thank you for having us. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, it's
have a lovely evening.
Blast. We barely scratched the surface.
Indeed.
I know. Yeah, but nobody does a 2-hour panel. I promise. It would be towards the end. We'd be like Willie Nelson on that long tape where we're just taking requests. So
Bruce, congrats! It's a terrific book.
Oh well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
It really is phenomenal.
Writing for smaller presses is like dropping a brick down a deep well, and you wait to hear a splash. So so glad someone saw it. So thank you.
I'm so glad. All right. Well, you guys have a fantastic evening, and I will talk to you soon.
Good night, y'all.
Thank you.
Night.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
You too.